Let's pick up with concept 25.2. It says the fossil record documents the history of life, and it says the fossil record reveals changes in the history of life on Earth. From this point forward, the evidence mounts and becomes stronger and stronger and stronger. Now, of course, the fossil record will never be a complete record of all the changes that have occurred in life on Earth, simply because, well, for a variety of the reasons that we're going to talk about coming up. Fossilization is a rare process. Fossilization tends to occur to only certain creatures, and then finding those fossils, of course, is a difficult and rare process as well. But the evidence we do have is pretty amazing, and we continue to fill in more and more evidence every year. Archaeologists are always hard at work filling in more gaps, and we combine that with the evidence that we have through other processes, through the study of geography and geology and biology and chemistry, and putting all that together, and we have a strong suite of evidence to back up the scientific knowledge that we have about how life has changed here on planet Earth. Just to provide some brief background about how fossils form in the fossil record, sedimentary rocks are rocks that are basically created from the remains of other rocks. If you studied your rock cycle, you have sedimentary rocks would be like sandstone and the like. They are deposited into thin layers called strata, and they are by far the richest source of fossils. The other two types of rock, igneous and metamorphic, tend to go through a variety of changes that basically destroy the fossils that might be contained in them. So you're not going to find a lot of fossils in metamorphic or igneous rock because of the geologic changes that have occurred that have destroyed those fossils. So for the most part, fossils are found in sediments and sedimentary rocks. We also find some fossil, or I guess you could call it ancient remains of, say, insects trapped in amber, which is petrified tree sap. And then if you're looking at more recent creatures like mammals frozen in ice, like for example we have some fine examples of woolly mammoths that have been frozen in ice in Siberia, that have been basically frozen in ice for long periods of time, but now when we remove them, some of them still even have the hair and the skin, and amazing samples that we can get from those. But of course those creatures lived quite a bit more recently than some of the ones we're going to look at. Within the notes folder, there's a brief video of the Grand Canyon, of course, a great example showing all the various layers, the strata of sedimentary rock. Grand Canyon is basically an amazing history book of fossils. The deeper you go into the canyon, the further back in time you go. Your textbook on page 511 has a great layout of a number of pictures here. In this one, we're starting at the bottom and working our way up toward the present, and it talks about some of the various fossilized creatures, or the remains of fossilized creatures that you find. Way back 3.5 billion years ago, we have fossilized remains of very simple creatures called stromatolites that formed microbial mats, and we'll talk about that, all the way up through more recent creatures, all the way up here to Tiktaalik, which is an ancient ancestor that eventually led to land-dwelling creatures and eventually on to mammals. And then of course we have some of the dinosaurs that we're familiar with. We have other sea living creatures all the way up to the present time. You'll see this MYA. I kind of use that quite a bit too in my notes. MYA just means millions of years ago. So like this says 100 MYA, that means 100 million years ago. Like I mentioned, the fossil record is in no way a complete accounting of evolution on Earth over time. There's no way that it could be. Few individuals have fossilized. That's kind of a rare process. That creature would have had to have lived in an ocean and fallen to the ocean floor, or lived in or around or near a lake or a place where sedimentary rock is likely to form. The animal's body would have been had to be buried fairly quickly so it wouldn't be scavenged and torn apart, and the skeleton basically spread by predators and scavengers. So there's a lot of things that had to happen for fossilization to occur. So that's somewhat rare. And then of course you have to discover the existing fossils, and again that's a difficult and somewhat rare process. And the fossil record, by the nature of fossilization, is biased in favor of certain species. For example, species that existed for a long time, well, obviously you're more likely to find fossils of those creatures. Or species that were very abundant and widespread, same thing. Species that had hard parts like shells and skeletons, soft-bodied creatures like a jellyfish, you're not likely to find any fossil remains. So of course it's not a complete record. No scientist would tell you that it is, but it certainly is a major part of what we know about the history of life on Earth, and archaeologists are finding more fossils every day, continually adding to our knowledge, filling in the few gaps that we do have of the evolutionary record of life on Earth. Here's a brief little animation that kind of talks about the geologic record and change over time. Just right click and hit play. Watch this brief animation if you would like. One thing to note is that the finding of fossils, a lot of people think it's just random chance, that archaeologists perhaps just go out and dig around until they accidentally come up with something, and that does happen on occasion. There have been some major fossil finds that were accidental, in some cases not even found by scientists but found by other people, just kids and adults doing other things. But fossil discoveries can also be a matter of prediction. A good example is the finding of a fossil that's called Tiktaalik. It's an early terrestrial vertebrate, and they looked specifically for fossils like this one by targeting sedimentary rocks from a specific time and environment. So there was basically a hypothesis that was tested where they said, okay, we are looking for this creature that falls between these other two types, and that would kind of be a bridge between these species. We expect to find it in this area, and we expect to find it in this strata of rock based on everything else we know. That is a prediction that can be tested. So they did that, and they found this particular fossil which falls within that bridge that they were looking for, and that was a predictable, well, it was a testable prediction, and that one was proved to be correct based on the fossil record. One excellent question to ask is, how are the various rocks and fossils that paleontologists and archaeologists look at, how are they dated? How do we come to an understanding of how old these things are? How do we know that this dinosaur is X number of million years old? Well, the sedimentary strata revealed the relative ages of the fossils. We know that the sediments are laid down in a step-by-step manner. We know that the further down we go into the lower levels of the strata, that those lower levels are older than the upper levels. So that's a relative age. It doesn't tell us this year, 1965 or 100 million years ago. It simply tells us that the older layers are lower and the top layers tend to be more young. But what about the absolute age? The absolute age of fossils can be determined through a variety of methods. One of those is called radiometric dating. And I want you to take note that when we say absolute, we don't mean that it's an errorless perfect date. No one can say this dinosaur lived and died on August 24th, 650 million years ago. That's not possible. But when we say absolute, we mean the age is given in a year or a date range of years, rather than just a relative term such as before or after or later or younger. So what we're going to look at is basically different types of radioactive isotopes, where a parent isotope decays to what we call a daughter isotope at a specific constant rate. So these isotopes basically decay, fall apart, emit radioactive energy, and they do so at a very specific, a very constant rate. Each isotope has what we call a half-life, and that's the time required for half of the isotope to decay. Different isotopes have a different variety of half-lives, and we can use this information to help date either the fossil or maybe the remains that we find, or the rocks near, in, and around the fossil. In some cases, the isotope, such as the carbon-14 isotope, that collects within the animal or the living creature's body, and it remains in the fossil. Within your body, you have variations of carbon. You have regular carbon-12, but you also contain carbon-14. In other cases, the isotopes are collected from layers of rock above and below the sample to kind of provide an age range. So the age range may be 50 million years or something like that, but you have to think we're talking about a time scale of billions of years. So even if it's a range of, say, 500,000 years, that's a pretty specific range in the context of billions. Your book shows a nice little diagram of this radiometric dating with this half-life of an isotope. So what you have is basically a half-life is one half-life represents one half of the original amount has decayed, and then when one half of that amount decays, and then one half of that amount, and one half of that amount. So after 4 half-lives, you would only have 1/16 of the original amount. These time periods may range anywhere from hundreds of years to thousands to millions of years, depending on the isotope you're talking about. Carbon-14 has a fairly short lifespan, a fairly short half-life, so radiocarbon dating can be used to date fossils up to about 75,000 years old. So those would not be a lot of the fossils of, say, dinosaurs and the like. They lived quite a bit longer ago than that. But if you were looking at, say, the remains of ancient civilizations, or you were looking at something that occurred 50,000 years ago, radiocarbon dating would be a good way, a precise way to get you a date for that material. Older fossils use different isotopes. Some isotopes can be used to date rocks that are below and above the fossil to give you an age range, and there are some isotopes that have a half-life in the millions of years, so you can go back quite a bit more. If you want some information about how that works in radiometric dating, there's a link right here. It says what happened when, and that takes you to a variety of information about how we date fossils and how we get the age ranges that we do for various fossils and archaeological and paleontology, all of those various finds that we're talking about. One of the things we're going to look at in this chapter is the origin of entire new groups of organisms. So we're talking about macroevolution, major changes like the rise of mammals, or the beginning of flying birds, or the beginning of terrestrial land-based animals, or flowering plants. Some fossils provide a pretty detailed look at the origin of these new groups, and the fossils are pretty central to our understanding of evolution because they show us how new features, new anatomical features arise, and how long it takes for these changes to occur. Say, for example, if we look at the origin of mammals, mammals belong to a large group of creatures called tetrapods. Tetra meaning four limbs, land-based creatures. And the evolution of some unique mammalian features can be traced through the gradual changes over time. In your textbook, they talk about how the jawbone of ancient creatures that were tetrapods have changed over time to become basically some of the inner ear of some modern mammals. So if you look at the text on page 513, and it talks about the origin of some of these mammals, you can see some of these changes over time. In this case, it's showing some of the changes to some of the various jaw hinge bones, and you can see how over time there have been a variety of changes, and how evolution has sculpted and natural selection has changed some of these creatures as the years passed. So we're going to find out later, like for example, there are certain bones in early mammalian or species that led to mammals that were part of the jaw, but later kind of developed and moved until they became what are some of the tiny bones in our inner ears. So they started out as a portion of the jaw, and now in most mammals they act as a portion of the ear and transmit sound to the brain. So you're going to find that evolution basically tinkers and messes with what it has to try to improve the creature to better match its environment and to better be able to survive and reproduce. Alright, let's take another quick break. When we come back, Concept 25.3, we're going to get into basically the timeline from early creatures all the way up into today, and we'll talk about some of the wording of how we split that timeline into what we call eras and epochs and things of that nature. That'll be when we come back.